I know most of you, and most of you know me, but I don't know, and Tommy knows me better than he needs to for years and years. I do run an organization that's statewide that is for crime victims. I have emergency funds 24/7, have attorneys, faith outreach. So we do a lot of things. We've been around for 30 years, so I represent a lot of crime victims. Chairman Pope, I heard all the previous solicitors and whatnot that testified, and everybody talked about the perception, talked about what's the public's perception. And when I talk to the public, and I do that a lot, the public sees political incest. Judges appointed that have been members of the General Assembly, especially the House Judiciary, their sons, daughters, law partners, wives, political figures. The judiciary looks like a way to reward insiders, inside ball game, true or not. That's the perception. Sometimes perception is reality. That's not to say that some of the appointments are not worthy judges. I'm not here to bash individuals, although that's a temptation, only to point out flawed system. I agree with many of the comments that were made by others. I've looked at 22 bills that have been pre-filed, are already filed, and I understand there's a lot more coming down. Representative Ott and Cobb Hunter, I really like your bill. Most of those deal with, all candidates being reviewed, not just three. No lawyer legislators on the JMSC. The governor would have some appointing ability. Citizens committed. That committee, Citizens Committee, is appointed by the Senate and the House. So I mean, it gets worse that there's too much legislation control over what's going on. Several of the bills give more power to that committee of citizens. Actually puts one of them on the committee. Term limits, caps, more input, from other people. And I, would be supportive of that. And we've heard all this, and we've beaten a dead horse about it. And I'm confident from what I've seen of the 22, bills that have been introduced that everybody's honing in on what we'd like to see. I want to concentrate on the magistrate system. The latest that I've heard from the court is that about 85% of all the litigation in the state takes place in the lower courts. That's important. It's important that people have their, that are magistrates have their hands on the pulse of their community, even though there may be a better way to do that. I don't know how many of you have followed along on the magistrates through the years. Of course, I've been doing this for 40 years, so I see it swing this way, swing that way. There's a section 22-119 of the magistrate's law that it creates an advisory council on magistrate eligibility and certification, examination, and continuing education membership. My group is on that. I have never been to one of these committees. I have never been called to participate. I talked to our Sheriff's Association and other people that are mentioned in this law. They've never been asked to do anything. We're supposed to be submitting an annual report to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court about what we think about magistrates. There's nothing in the bill, though, that says who calls a meeting. There's nothing that says that who is their secretary, to go with it, that's going to put all this together. It just makes this committee. And I'm assuming, Representative Ott, that you looked at some of this when you were making your bill, because it includes a lot of individuals that are not on the JMSC, like prosecutors, like crime victims. We did last year put in a crime victim on JMSC, a good one. It's important that all the stakeholders are included in some way. It's not the criminal's justice system. It's the citizens' justice system, and we have to be careful that we don't let it be inside ball game. And I appreciate being able to come here today and speak to you. I was a little miffed that crime victims' attorneys were not included in the first hearings, because we feel like we are a part of the judicial system, not just the public. And my attorney, my chief counsel, could not be here today. She had already made all of her plans before we knew when this meeting was taking place. But I'm sure she's capable of writing you some of her issues. And that's basically all I have to say.
Thank you, Ms. Hudson. A couple things. One, we actually ran across that 22-119, and I was like you. I was going, well, this may be the answer to our whole section 3, of the magistrate stuff. But
Right.
If you recall, it's much like the docketing committee and many others we've served on over the years. And so it may be something on 22-119 that this committee may look at as part of our recommendations.
Right.
We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
But just kind of ask the Chief Justice to get the band back together, so to
That's
speak.
right.
So I also want to share from the Citizens Committee, members, in your materials, and those that didn't take your book home like I did should have them in your book. The rest of us is electronically. Nancy Jo Thomason is an attorney up in Greenville that chaired the Citizens Committee for that region. And she indicated in great detail the value that she sees in the Citizen Committee, because we're looking, can we do things for the candidate's sake to bring Citizen Committee and the Bar Committee together to make sure that element's there, but also make sure it's efficient, again, so you're not doing the same thing twice. So I just have to name these things when I write them down. You brought it up, so I want to share with them. Mr. Ott's recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hudson, thanks for being here.
Yes, sir.
We haven't had really any conversations regarding this issue, so it's good to be able
You get it.
to have that
You get it.
conversation. I'm gonna try not to show my fear of you at this particular point. I've heard, and I got you to laugh, so mission accomplished.
I'll accept respect.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Respect's a better word. Well, let's talk about respect. That's where I was going to go first. I do hate that it seems like this process has gotten down to a point, I think, over the course of many months and time, where we paint with this really broad brush, right? I really am coming at this from both sides. I think there's been some unfairness levied from whatever perspective or side that you find yourself, on. So, we have good judges in the state, correct?
We do.
Right.
We have a couple of them that I wouldn't say were, but most of them are good.
Well, and that's what gets people though, right there, is that hint at, there's some bad ones.
One bad apple.
I'm with you, but what that does is that plants that seed of, well, I wonder who is it? Yeah. Well, now somebody that gets caught up in that legal system, right? Well, do I have that bad judge that I have, been told is out there, and am I going to get a fair shake? And I think we actually can do ourselves harm when we don't address it from a perspective of, no. The vast majority of our judges are great ethical judges. I think that
I agree with that.
Right, and I believe I think that when a judge is found to be qualified and nominated, they are absolutely qualified. I don't know that I've seen any candidate come through this process that I don't think was qualified to be a judge. Now, would I vote for them based off of information? That's up to the body. But nevertheless, we're going to put that aside. We have good, ethical lawyer legislators, correct?
For the most part.
Right. But again, that's important to say so that we aren't painting with a broad brush and insinuating to the public that if you are a lawyer legislator in South Carolina, you are a bad person. You are corrupt to the core, because that is not the case. And I think that's important for us to say.
I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think there's some bad apples that have given it a bad name.
Yes, ma'am, and which is why I think it's so important that we say that it's not overarching, that there are...
I would agree with that.
Right, and that's why I just want to put it out there for whoever may be looking. And I think that there is some blame and responsibility. I have poured into this issue, like a lot of folks have, right?
Right.
And I've learned so much. I think that a lot of times, do you think it's human nature sometimes when you don't get what you want, that you look for an excuse?
Sure.
Or you point and you blame sometimes whatever you can find to justify in our own human minds that we got the short end of the stick.
Maybe.
And I think that we have to try to, push back against that possibility sometimes. So, here's what I've struggled with.
Okay.
There's been a lot of accusations, and I cannot thank our victims advocates enough, right?
Thank you.
I've seen them. I know the work
They're
that y'all
awesome.
do. I really, I've got personal friends that work in that. I don't know how they deal with it, with what they see, how they hold things together for these victims and for these families. But we've got a lot of victims out there, right? We don't
More than defendants.
Yes, ma'am. We don't always, though, do we put our judges sometimes in untenable positions when perhaps we have a prosecutor or a solicitor that might make recommendations to the judges that would be contrary to what the family and the victim's advocate would recommend to the judge? What is a judge supposed to do in that situation?
Well, crime victims know that prosecutors do not represent them.
Excuse me?
They represent the state. And
Correct.
I'm constantly telling crime victims that the prosecutor is not your attorney, and they represent the state. So there's going to be conflict many times. The judge is a trier of the fact. That's why we want the crime victim to be able to speak and to be, present and have elocution in a courtroom. They have to listen to all of it. And we would love to have crime victims have their own attorneys. Well, I only have 7 of them, and they are drinking out of a fire hose.
No, I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
But there are those situations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where
It's not the same.
solicitor and prosecutor may recommend a bond or a sentence that might be less than what is requested by the family.
Right.
And I don't know.
The prosecutor has the final say. He has to consult with the victim, but he does not have to do what they want.
Correct. But do you think that sometimes we can unfairly bash a judge that does not go with what the victim's advocate or family is asking / representing or requesting, and then ends up going with the solicitor or a prosecutor's recommendation? I guess where I'm going is solicitors and prosecutors have a huge responsibility as well in this process.
Sure.
By doing their homework and making sure that they are in contact with the families and the victim's advocate. Because if not, and if they're just rolling through things very quickly, then a lot of times, and a judge is trying to go through these cases, might not have evidence in front of them, might be a guilty plea, right?
Right.
That was entered into between the prosecution and the defendant. Judge might not have the opportunity to look at the evidence, and so now we're just being presented with a guilty plea. We've got to make a ruling, and then later on down the road, something happens. That person that pled guilty, or the judge accepted the recommendation of the prosecutor or the solicitor, they do something else later on down the road, and then what do? Sometimes we go right back to what that judge may or may not have sentenced them to and say, well, what is that person doing out on our streets?
And that happens a lot.
And I guess that's all I'm trying to make sure that we are all coming at this from true intentions, not to bash one side or the other, Mr. Chairman, but to accept responsibility where we all need to accept responsibility to make this system better and more fair for the citizens.
Well, in my 40 years of being down here, I'm old. I'm going to be 80 in 2 weeks.
Oh, you don't look it though, Ms. Hudson.
I look 100, right?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
I always like that statement. I like to think of St. Paul saying, not only do we not do bad, we don't give the appearance of doing bad. And I think that's what we're trying to solve here.
I could not agree more. Thank you for that. Just want to throw one more about the magistrates out there at you. I would ask for you to go back and talk with your folks you know, I'm kind of rolling this out a little by little as far as what we talked about earlier, Mr. Chairman. You know, we have these judges, right? These circuit court judges that go around and operate within that circuit. Y'all take a look at maybe having our magistrates operate that way as well. Perhaps to maybe be appointed from within a judicial circuit, perhaps, where they could be moved around also and serve within different localities.
That's
You know,
not
if
a
we
bad
have-
idea.
If we have backlogs or something like that. Okay, sounds good. I just ask you to take that into consideration.
Okay.
Thank you,
All
ma'am.
right.
Every
Sure.
time we talk, Mr. Ott, I think of another issue. So one, I want to thank Ms. Hudson, and I'm coming to you, Mr. Robbins. I want to thank Ms. Hudson because I've been with her about 30 of those 40 years, and I know
Bless your heart.
she could have cut with a lot sharper blade than she did, so I certainly appreciate it. One thing I think that keeps coming up with the magistrates, and I was thinking about this earlier testimony, we run into the whole county funding of magistrates.
Right.
And kind of the unfunded mandate, you know, Mr. Ott using, for example, I was thinking, and same thing happened to me with solicitors. I had solicitors in York, and Union didn't really provide any, so I'm kind of taking York employees to Union, and it became, because that was my more affluent county and my other county, and so that's just something, I'm just throwing that out again, while the, you know, stream of consciousness while it's popping in my head. The magistrate thing, the bigger issue, even when we talk about lawyer magistrates, I think there's a lot of merit to that. You then have to make pay commensurate with it. And who's
Right.
going to do it, Calhoun County or the state? And so, Mr. Robinson, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to say that before y'all get too far down this road of magistrates serving in other counties, you might want to talk to your county councils before you before you start doing that. Ms. Hudson, thank you so much for coming.
Yes,
and I've always admired your tenacity as an advocate for your causes. And as Mr. Ott said, I even am scared to even ask you a question sometimes, but I need to ask a couple. And I guess the first one I would ask is, when you said that you think there are a couple of bad judges, is it because you believe that they are not qualified to be judges, or is it because they may have philosophies on the bench and they may have levied sentences that you don't agree with?
No, it's interesting. I'm glad you asked that question, because most of the complaints that I get from crime victims is not about the sentence. It's about the demeanor of the judge.
Okay.
There are judges, very few, that will roll their eyes, that will blow, that, it's obvious they're bored, or they don't, they're making, some sort of, it's just, and that's why the Citizens Committee is so important to this JMFC, because they are more in a position to say, this guy doesn't have judicial demeanor. I mean, I'd make a terrible judge. I'm so sarcastic. I mean, I'd be awful. It's just demeanor.
Yeah.
And when I say that they're bad, I won't say they're a bad judge, but they don't come up to the standard of behavior that I think we need to expect from a judge.
Gotcha. All right. And I can tell you that today versus when I was a young lawyer, that demeanor situation's gotten a whole lot better. But I do understand where you're coming from,
Right.
and I think that's the worst thing. And I can go back to my days as a prosecutor, just as Mr. Pope has prosecuted, that the worst thing you can do is make somebody feel like they've been disrespected.
Right.
And so I would hope that, being the dean of victim advocacy as you are, that you could have the opportunity at some point to tell any judge that was exhibiting bad demeanor that, hey, you might want to think
I write
about.
them really nice letters,
Gotcha. All right.
and I make complaints to the Chief Justice.
Point number two.
Yes, sir.
To the idea that citizens, non-lawyers, should serve on the JMSC, and back to this appearance of impropriety argument that you make and that some others have made, and I want to quote my good friend Representative Thigpen: influence is going to be there no matter what. You cannot get influence out of any political environment. But if you were to appoint a citizen, and let's just use an example, you've got a local businessman or woman who owns a local business, or is an employee of a big corporation, and they are placed on the JMSC. Would that person then, if their company was a plaintiff or a defendant in a circuit court in South Carolina, would that person as a member of the JMSC be prohibited from going in front of the judge that they put on the bench, or any judge for that matter?
That's a good question, because there's always going to be, as you say, some influence coming from no matter what we do.
So I take that as do you believe that that would be a problem?
I do. I think it would be a problem, and that's why the governor needs to do the appointment, let y'all off the hook.
Well, but if the governor appoints a citizen, that doesn't change the fact that you've got a citizen in front of that judge. And so I'm trying to distinguish between this argument that lawyer legislators should not be on JMSC because they appear before these judges, and some may and some not. I don't think y'all are taking into consideration there could be a non-litigation attorney on the JMSC, but it's not going to change any if Joe Businessman is on the JMSC and he's going in front of this judge when his company is being sued.
Yeah, but his attorney is going in front of that judge, and that's a vast difference between that and practicing law in front of the judge.
Well, no, not necessarily. And to the folks that want to have judges run political campaigns, what if the corporation is donating to the judge? Is that a problem?
Are you talking about general elections?
Yes, ma'am.
No, and I'm totally against it.
Me too. But my point is,
Nelson Mullin would own all of them.
you've got I'm not going to go there. You've got a corporation, though, that is before the court that is on the JMSC. Is that not a situation where that's a problem?
Well, if somebody, I see a big difference of, my company is in common pleas, and we're, I know the judge and blah, blah, blah. I think that's different than an attorney practicing in front of and getting special privilege, which I have seen happen many, many times.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Bamberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one thing I think to consider, particularly with regards to the magistrate piece, is what Representative Ott brought up about the circuit and things like that. I think from the victim standpoint, and some people may not know that I grew up in a law enforcement household 30 years, right, my whole life.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Yeah, so I've seen what about as close as you can get from actually putting on a uniform is living in the house with somebody who had to do it every day. And I think it's lost on some folks that the victims and the arrests that they want to see happen, most of the time, and a lot of times, the search warrants, the arrest warrants, those are all things that are signed at night.
Yep.
Right? So imagine if you live on the side of Bamberg County where I do, and they have eyes on this person they've been looking for that, hey, we see the guy that murdered we know he's in this house. Oh, wait, our magistrate doesn't live here. We got to drive 50 minutes to an hour to Aiken.
Yeah, good point.
Get it signed, drive 50 minutes to an hour back, in 2 hours they're gone in the wind. And now you have a victim who's heartbroken because the chance was missed. So I think there's a lot more to it than
Well, I think that could be worked out.
Just
by
higher
having,
level,
because you've got several magistrates in a county. So, I mean, you just...
Correct. It's all a part of the general context of looking at everything.
Right.
Because we wouldn't want to cut off our nose to spite our face in certain
Right.
regards. And thank you, too, for appearing today. And I promise you don't look 100 at all. I hope I age as well as you have. Thank you
it's
so
from being
much.
down here at the General Assembly.
I was thinking you sound like Eddie Haskell, talking about you look lovely, Mrs. Cleaver, but I'm dating myself saying that. Ms. Thayer's recognized.
First of all, after this is over, let's talk skincare. Clearly, you know a secret. I like that they said that you were the Dean of Victims Advocates, because certainly you are, and we appreciate all your hard work on that.
Thank you.
We talked about, or you talked about, a judge's demeanor. And I'm just curious, have you ever reported that?
Yes.
And if so, was there a response? Did you feel like there was an outcome from that, or that was just ignored?
From the Chief Justice, I think it was not ignored at all.
Okay. But that judge is still there, maybe perhaps reprimanded or what have you. So I guess one of the things that I'm trying to get at is, do you feel like we have issues maybe with the judges that are already sitting there and we're not doing a good job when they come up to be reappointed, that we're not doing a good enough job there? Is that more of what the issues you see? Or do you feel like these are newer judges that have recently been appointed and sitting on the bench?
Oh, that's a hard question because I'm having to think of individuals. Sometimes, and Tommy will, Pope will know who I'm talking about, so I need to be careful. Getting rid of a sitting judge is difficult. I don't care what they've done.
Okay.
It's very difficult to get rid of them. And that brings up another point of we need to make it easier for crime victims and citizens to register complaints. There needs to be a website that says, this is how you do this. It's very intimidating to somebody who doesn't know the criminal justice system. An average citizen has had Civics 101 and it ain't South Carolina.
Right.
You know, so they, you know, are intimidated that they have to do a written, you know, complaint, that they have to go through the process, and then several times, well, I can think of two, where they didn't feel like they were properly heard by the GMSC. There was a certain amount of arrogance that was there. Well, you're just a private citizen. You're not an attorney. You don't know what you're talking about. That can be an issue. Do we need to have a review? Yes. The judge that our crime victims did get rid of several years ago really had some medical issues that were not being recognized. He had not been approved by the bar. He had failed it, and he was still sitting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was a difficult thing for me to get involved in. My husband would call me the Chinese water torturist, you know. That's sometimes what you have to do. But yeah, I'm trying to answer your question. I do think that there are occasions where somebody has been seated who was doing a fine job and then they didn't. And that, you know, there needs to be a review process.
Right, right. I mean, I guess that's, you know, just from the outside looking in, and certainly I'm not in a courtroom every day as a non-attorney, but just maybe more of a review process of the judges that we have sitting there. So anyway, I just wondered if you agreed with that statement. Okay.
I do.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you do.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Thigpen.
Thank you so much for sharing such candid responses, and we do hope that not only your wisdom, you know, flows and overflows in the cup that we have here, but also your grace and beauty, as you stated your age and how well you look for. We heard in testimony in past hearings about, you know, judicial legitimacy being made up of competence, impartiality, and independence. And we've heard a lot today about cases where individuals believe they were harmed because of the improper actions of judges. When we ask that question of competence, independence, and impartiality. When we start talking about influence and the appearance or perception of wrongdoing, that comes into the impartiality thing.
Right.
Do you think that's more based on the person and their character or ethics, or do you think that is a systemic problem that we have, that something that we need to address within the system?
Well, I don't know how exactly to address that in the system, but do I think that it's a problem individually? Yes. You know, a prosecutor should be a lonely person. He can't have many friends. It's true. You can't play golf with just everybody. You know, it's a lonely job because you don't want to give the impression of impartiality. And I think an individual has to be aware of that.
Right.
I see more of that at the magistrate's level than I do at circuit court.
Okay. The second part is, you know, as we talk about, I don't think there's an issue with competence. I think you may have mentioned one at the very end, that competence. But I think credentials, education, qualifications, I think we check that box. But when it comes to independence, because that's what I'm trying to balance here. So, you know, we talk about, I think the first gentleman talked about judges who repeatedly had done things wrong according to, you know, there was no evidence. There was just, you know, his testimony. Independence is the ability to insulate judges from fear of being threatened or removed or
Yep.
you better judge this way or
Oh, yeah.
else. And so on one hand, we want to allow a judge to be able to, you know, make a judgment without any fear of repercussions for that judgment.
That's right.
But at the same time, we want to weed out individuals who, or reprimand individuals who are not up to standard. And so how do you have, or can you speak to how we balance both wanting to insulate and not have judges be under the threat, but at the same time, those who may not have the demeanor, or those who may not necessarily be executing their duties as they should? How do we balance that?
Well, I think some of the bills address that by staggering terms, by the person who seated you is not going to reseat you. So I think those things that's a good idea, and I think that would help.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Thigpen, that, you know, I'm talking about my buckets all the time. That's one that the staggering of terms
Yeah.
and, you know, term limits and trying to make sure that I couldn't preside over your judgeship twice in a row
Yeah.
is something that will be in that bucket when we get there. Let's see, who's next? No, we got, Mr. Bailey, and then I'll get Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hudson, I'm kind of one of the non-lawyers, but spent many years in law enforcement dealing
Yes,
with
sir.
victims. So I appreciate what all you've done for the state of South Carolina, especially those victims out there. But I hear you, and I hear many of the people in the audience talking about how we need to set up this new system and the changes we need to make. And I always fall back to, and talking to my colleagues here, it really doesn't, and see if you agree, it really doesn't matter what system we end up with if we don't have the proper grievance process
Right.
and we don't have the proper enforcement tools to make sure that misconduct's not occurring in the courtroom, we're wasting our time.
That's true.
So they kind of go hand in hand. So if we don't make this a whole layout of how we're going to conduct ourselves in the courtroom, along with making sure we get the right judges there and how we do that, then this whole process is going to be a failure. And I just want to make sure my colleagues know that we've got to make sure that the individuals we put in courtrooms as judges, and you all are confident that they're going to be held accountable if there's misconduct. And I think that's the premise of how we got here today, is that a lot of people that you talk to that have been in the courtroom don't trust the system. And I don't think that there's a lot of things that are going wrong. I just think we're not being transparent, and we don't have a proper grievance process where people feel like their voices are being heard. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to working with my colleagues here to come up with an answer of what it needs to look like when we get finished. But you all participating is very important, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Wheaton, you know I'm going to give a commentary between every question. So I looked up, there is a website on how to register complaints with the court, but, and that's, you know, the link on the Judicial Department website for ODC that would apply to both judges and lawyers. I think the difficulty in that is that, as many of you know, at least the attorneys know, the ODC process is very closed until you get to a certain level. And it works both ways, because the advantage is if I'm just mad at you and it's really not an issue, I don't besmirch your reputation or
Right.
your career. So that's something we can explore too, that would exist maybe in what we're calling our wraparound services with judges, and one of my many buckets, Mr. Big Pig. But that may be something that we could look at in conjunction with that too. Mr. Wooten's recognized.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and Ms. Hudson, I will not get out of here with everybody else sucking up to you without telling you that she is my constituent. And for my entire time in Lexington, I've watched this beautiful lady riding around in a convertible Camaro with her late great Bobby Earl, and you should see when that hair down and the convertible's down and it's flowing. So, Ms. Hudson, I just wanted to say thank you again for coming and all you do. We've worked together on many things, and this will be one of them. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Mr. Newton is never going to let me preside again. This thing's gone so far in the ditch, but thank you. Let's see, Molly Vick. Molly? Hi. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm Molly Vick. I'm from Charleston County. And hopefully I am the delightful end of today for y'all. It's been kind of a long afternoon. I feel very grateful to be following everyone up, because everyone's touched on what I have written down in my bullet points, so I'm not going to keep you for too long. As far as the panel is concerned, I do have one thing I would like you to maybe just think about, and I'm not a lawyer, I have no background, this is just simply me throwing some brainstorming into the air for y'all in a way that I think might be helpful. And I'm not gonna kill you with the legislator stuff. And ironically, I had a city prosecutor about a year ago when I was asking him, like Mr. Ott said, which is super ironic. So a little bit ago, I had written down human nature to speculate, to find a reason for perceived mistreatment, right? So I was talking to this prosecutor, and he was patient enough to talk to me for like a lot longer than he probably needed to. And he kept saying legislation, legislation, legislation. And as a victim, I was like frazzled. I'm like, that really doesn't mean anything to me. Like, I just feel like completely kind of left in the dust at the time, but now I'm here. So I took the time to really look into what he was saying, and I did go to one of the JMSC hearings in November. Not really sure what, I know what happened with that, but I don't really know what happened with that, which goes back to the transparency issue. And I do have a question / request as far as judges having complaints made against them. Like, I have not personally done that. I was just a little nervous to hear the amount of complaints that I think this candidate, and I don't know how many, I don't have facts behind this, it just appeared that a lot of people had complained against him. And I'm wondering if there's a point in time where, if the same complaints are being made or the same subject matter is being brought up, how that can be addressed before it gets to the point where people are feeling like Mr. Ott said, you know, it's not personal, but when your life is in jeopardy or like you've lost a loved one, it feels very personal. And I worry that that will compound, right? So like you said, when your mind's made up that your feelings are hurt and that you think it's personal, but then you're hearing more and more things from the public. Like, I've had victims come to me personally who I don't know, who have said, you know, this judge let someone out on bond, and I'm not making it about him, I'm just saying generally speaking, I think people, the help I could ask from y'all would be maybe more like changing sentencing ranges, if that makes sense. So a lot of the things that I'm hearing from victims are that offenders are bonding out, and then someone will get a $100,000 bond, then a $50,000 bond, and it's just going back and forth, and they feel like lost in the wayside. And so even though some of your circuits don't have any victims advocates employed right now, like there are empty positions, which is terrifying for y'all, terrifying for us. And I'm here for solution-based purposes, I'm not calling anybody out. I just think it would be really helpful to have like mental health professionals maybe introduced to the panel in some way, educators introduced to the panel in some way, maybe a doctor here or there, because I watched y'all argue for 7 hours a couple of weeks ago, and not one person was a doctor. So, and I'm not trying to be rude by any means, it's just kind of like, I think everyone was at a little bit of a loss when you're like, all right, hold on, like we're all thinking the same way. Can we have someone with a different perspective who does have the background that can be helpful to us? So it seems to me at this point like a lot of dead horses are being beat, for lack of a better term. And I can't imagine how, you know, frustrating that must be for y'all. And just from a citizen's perspective, I think maybe incorporating people with a different profession just a little bit. I'm not trying to come in and rip y'all up, and because I don't have the background to be doing that because I wouldn't know what I was talking about. But I think maybe perhaps additional professional perspectives.
I will tell you a couple things, Ms. Vick. You know, you named transparency. I was trying to make notes. The bond issue. I'm a former prosecutor in one of my 30 other lives. So we have done a lot this year in trying to do for what we call the revolving door for that very reason. And you know, unfortunately, we see victims, particularly in domestic violence situations, others where it seems like he beats you home, you know, literally and physically. But so we're working on some of those things. The one thing that's kind of the core of what I was pulling out. Now I do want to have one question for you on the legislation thing that the prosecutor was saying. But one thing, I think we are looking at trying to figure out once somebody becomes a judge, one of the law professors said it to us best. They said, you have to find the balance between independence, so they're not under our thumb or under the committee's thumb, and accountability. Right. And I think that's where we keep trying to dial the dials, and even in talking to the court, I envision that hopefully we can come out with something when somebody becomes a judge, that's not the end of it. You know what I mean? That there's an opportunity, you know, and of course ODC is available, but which is, you know, disciplinary. But like you say, you may not want to pursue it, but you want to kind of go on record of noting this happened, or like Ms. Hudson said, a victim was treated a certain way. So I do think there's some things coming. Mr. Ott has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if it's really a question, Ms. Vick. Just thank you. Don't know you. I just think that it's never lost on me, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of my colleagues up here, that we get kind of caught up in our own little bubble a lot of times. And you're right. I think, I guess all I wanted you to say is you're the most qualified person to come and speak. Your perspective is the perspective that we should be focusing on, because unfortunately you have been in the system. Sure, you didn't ask to be there, but you ended up there. And so, you know, I think that's what we have to stay focused on, because that's what we're supposed to be, you know, trying to accomplish, is what is in the best interest of people like you. And I know that it's daunting a lot of times. We forget, you know, as being up here amongst each other, that it's not easy to come and testify. So not only to you, but everyone else in the public, you know, that doesn't have a vested interest on one side or the other. Thank you just simply for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you so much. And if I can just add a couple of things in response to your great, thank you so much. I really do appreciate that.
That's pretty slick how you said in response to my questions. Yeah, absolutely.
It was, I couldn't believe it that I had just written down almost verbatim what he said about, anyway, I'll move on. So in response to the gray area that you were saying with independence and accountability, so I think it would be beneficial also, maybe continuing education certificates for judges. And I mean this with all due respect, I feel like they also need to be checked on too. They can't talk to anybody. They have to be quiet all the time. This is a balanced thing, you know? It's not fair to, and I don't know any of them personally, but I know what it's like to feel silenced and not heard, and like you're making big decisions and, you know, this and that, and there's not really necessarily a network of support for you. So I think it would be beneficial to look at maybe some type of victim service certification or some type of exposure so that it's not just cut and dry pushing dockets.
It's ironic you said that, because one of my friends laughs because there's a term in social service talking about wraparound services, all the things you need to make, you know, a better family. And I use that thinking about, we need wraparound services for our judges, because once we pick them, a lot of time, a lot of effort, you know, like you heard, a lot of them are very well qualified, but maybe they need some help or guidance. And so I'm hopeful that's something this committee can do too.
And I mean, I've experienced really wonderful judges too. So I don't want to come up here and be like, everything is wrong, this is terrible, because it's not black and white like that. And I don't want it to appear that way, but I really appreciate you listening to my personal suggestions, and if there could be like an empathetic therapist with all of you all the time, that would be great. But I know that's, you know, you can't even get victims advocates in some of these circuits, so that's a scary place to be.
Right. Mr. Bamberg's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I echo Representative Ott's sentiments. Thank you for coming. I can tell you're a little nervous.
Yeah.
A little nervous up there.
And I'm a little hungry.
Yeah, we are too. Well, those of us who showed up 30 minutes after, wink, wink. But no, I do want to say thank you for coming. I know it's not easy to stand up there and talk in front of the committee and try to walk a line and express your views without maybe going too far like some people have in the past, etc. I will say that one of the tough parts of being on the committee is trying to take bits and pieces from everyone who has input, and everybody's interaction with the system, depending on how much someone interacts with it, could be good, it could be horrendous, it could be in the middle. You talk to 1,000 people, you're going to have 1,000 different explanations of how they feel or what they experienced through the process. I do know that with sentencing, for example, some years back, when I was on crim laws, we looked at certain sentencing and things like this, and you do have the term like mandatory minimum sentences, and whether those are good or bad, or depending on what crime it's for, etc. And then with the judges, when there is not a mandatory minimum, for example, a lot of that is discretionary, and it ends up being a judgment call based on the judge, right? Some judges have been on the bench a long time, where their viewpoints are kind of, I'll say kind of known, basically, like, hey, this person is harder or this person is lighter. Some people are newer. It all just depends.
If I was a felon, I would definitely not be upset if I was in front of a certain person versus another.
Right. There are those perceptions, right? So in looking at it, we do not have an easy job up here. I know some people will look at it and say like, oh, well, X amount are lawyers, and obviously we're going to go one way or not. I think the committee is committed to looking at everything and trying to come up with sound recommendations that take into account, for example, your viewpoint and reading between the lines there. I get it, okay? But take into account that, as well as testimony from other victims, from people who've been litigants, et cetera. And thank you for coming up and testifying in front of us. It's truly appreciated.
Thank you. And lawyers are really important. Lawyers are really important. So definitely, like, you're very necessary, so I do not agree with all of you being stripped away.
No,
That would be,
folks wonder why I smile so much, and it's because so many ambulance chasing jokes and things like that. I'm like, I got to give people some reason to like me, you know.
well, I appreciate y'all for being here, and I didn't feel the need to go into my personal traumas and tribulations, because while everyone does have very valid feelings or thoughts or perceptions at a time, coming back from that and moving up from that varies from person to person. And I just think, I feel like I have a duty as a victim to other victims who don't feel like they're going to be heard, or who don't feel like they know what to say, or feel left in the dust, or feel alone. And I would just, again, like to be solution-based instead of bicker back and forth.
Sound like Ms. Hudson needs to give you an application. And,
I think she is royalty, and I will gladly accept. Seriously, I'm so honored to speak after you. And thank you so much for saying everything you said, so that it took so much burden off of me, too.
Thank you, Ms. Vick. Thank you.